So our next speaker today is Mr. Brynt Parmeter. He is the DoD Chief Talent Management Officer. Mr. Parmeter has a wealth of experience in talent acquisition and a career having served in uniform as an active duty Army officer. Prior to his appointment as the DoD's Chief Talent Management Officer, he was the head of non-traditional talent at Walmart, where he developed strategy using innovative sourcing and production approaches to upskill and reskill talent. Please help me join Mr. Brynt Parmeter.
Thank you, Star, and thanks to AFCEA and the CIO team, Mark, just for the opportunity to join you all. I know people trickle in and whatnot. I want to just tell a story over three different kind of chapters. The first is where we've been in the context of the broader DoD workforce journey over the last 2 years as a whole, where we are now in being completely honest and transparent with just you can read the news, you know what's going on, and I'll just tell you what it's like to sit in the rooms with the Doge or the other folks in the room, and then what is the opportunities for the next chapter and then in the future, and just talk through that. And Mark has a blow dart that he's ready to blow dart me in the neck if I go into a certain space that maybe isn't conducive to the conversation, but we'll go from there. So when I was brought in as the Chief Talent Management Officer, it's an inaugural role, and like most things, DoD doesn't do new well. And so there was a way to have to approach this as what is the value proposition? Who are the users? Who are the buyers? How do we think about this relationship in an organization that is, when the HR organization is very entrenched in its compliance-based approach to things, as you all know, and then the different functional communities have their cultures and how they want to work through things. The services have their cultures and whatnot. And then at the OSD level, the first time you meet everybody, they want to say, are you going to take my budget or my authorities? And that's how the building works. But you work through that. And what we did the first, I think of it in terms of 6-month integrals. In the first 6 months, we went through a review and we said, what are the top 10 challenges that DoD is facing in talent management? And again, what I'm going to talk about is the department as a whole, not just the cyber community. Mark knows more about the cyber community, and you all know more about the cyber community than I ever will, but this is DoD as a whole, of which I do think it's applicable to this community. We wanted to understand the challenges that have been talked about for the past 2 or 3 decades and distilled from a variety of studies, and we do a good job every quarter of saying, what do we got to work on? And it seemed to be the same 10 things that popped up each time. There was about 50 of them, but these are the top 10. And it was really, what is our future workforce requirements and how do we do planning for that on both across the total force, not just civilian, but all the different components on the uniform side as well. The employer brand and positioning that brand and how we do it and who are we trying to communicate to. Oftentimes we build brands that talk to ourselves instead of the target audiences, and we've got to do better at that. There's this notion of talent and applicant pools, and some people think we have to increase quantity, and some people think it's quality. And I'll tell you, I believe it's quality of the applicant pools, not because we don't have quality now, but much of what the panel just talked about with time to hire and HR processes, and Jing talked about it at the end, when you're in the HR side and you see things from their perspective, you realize they are stuck with a shit sandwich. I'm telling you, quote. So and here's what I mean by that. Anyone that I being the first person in the department to want to say, how can we help the HR community? And a lot of people in the business side of things on the department side will say, we can get rid of them. And I'm like, well, that's not realistic. What the HR community has to deal with is in the hiring process alone, just the hiring process, not counting all of the other verticals they're responsible in HR. There are 43 steps in the hiring process for DoD, 34 of which are congressionally mandated that are in statute. On top of that, of those 34, 11 OPM policies add additional clarifying requirements and 19 DoD policies add additional clarifying requirements. So they are incentivized based off of how compliant they are to that system. that is different than what the hiring manager is interested in. I'll now go to the hiring manager side on the whole timeline. We have 1 million hiring managers in the Department of Defense. There are 1 million different opinions on what they want for talent and whatnot. And the way we think of it as a God-given right for hiring managers to make every hiring decision for their team, which is a good thing in some ways, but maybe it's not the best way to do things in every case. I'll also say that we have a problem because look at just follow the trail I'm about to talk about in terms of numbers. Every month, not year, but every month in the DoD, across the department, just civilian jobs, this isn't counting the uniformed accessions, just civilian jobs, we have 40,000 job postings. 40,000. For those 40,000 job postings, we have 350,000 applicants. Of that, 40% are deemed eligible and qualified through the HR process. So then you get to about 160,000. Once those 160,000 get put on a certification and it goes in front of hiring managers, we have an 87% unused certification rate across the department. So 13% of 160,000, roughly 20,000 people, ever even get looked at by a hiring manager of the 350,000 that start at the top of the funnel. And there's a qualitative problem in that flow as it goes. And so that's what we talk about when we talk about talent and applicant pools, and getting to the fourth problem, which is the legislative and policy barriers to doing this more efficiently. Talked about the hiring timelines. When you do an apples-to-apples comparison, you use SHRM data, and you can use different data or look at it by workforce. But in aggregate, the industry average for an apples-to-apples comparison on time to hire is 55 days. That's from SHRM for corporate level kind of jobs that you're looking at. In DoD, it's 92 days is the time to hire average. Now, I would venture to say we cherry pick a little bit of our data in DoD to get an optimal number because that's a graded event for a lot of folks. It's more if you count it from time of vacancy until time of fill as opposed to what's in the middle. But that is what it is when we can do better. But it's not going to get better unless we work on the legislative and policy barriers together as a combined set of ledge proposals. Number 5, the candidate onboarding experience. When you come into an organization and you don't have a computer and you don't have things, when I was in the private sector for about 12 years before coming back to government, you show up on day one, here's your computer, here's your phone, here's your boss, there's your desk. We expect to have deliverables by tomorrow, kind of thing. And there's a way to get after that. And we don't do that very well here. And I don't know the answer to it, but it's just not done well. So when people come in and see that, they see it as a cultural difference, and it's an indicator of culture. The competitive and flexible compensation. You ask the people that do compensation for DoD, and they will show you the data that shows it is competitive. Tribal lore says it's not. And there are ways that you can show that you can make more money doing different things on the outside. But I would tell you, having been in nonprofits, academia, corporate and Fortune 1, startups, and the government in uniform and as a civilian, pays roughly pay along the way. You're not going to make, you do the total compensation, everything you get, it's roughly the same wherever you go. It's roughly the same in terms of the type of work, the things you get out of it, what you're compensated with totally. But we can do a better job, and we should. And things like the SWIMBY that does targeted supplements and whatnot are a very important tool to really differentiate the value proposition to folks. The last ones are modernizing talent management processes and technology. When you are focused on fixing things from a broader workforce point of view, you can either do policy, process, technology, or culture. And really, you got to tackle all four, and we'll get at that. But the processes and the technology are kind of the ones right up front. They're the easiest ones, and you got to get them at least somewhat right for the other two, for the policy and that culture things to work out. The other one is upskilling and reskilling, and I really applaud what the DoD CIO is doing. We're making skills-based hiring a priority. There are, if you look at 5 populations in the country, and we did this data when I was at Walmart, if you look at first generation return to work populations, which are mostly caregivers and mostly women who've left the workforce for those responsibilities, you look at formerly incarcerated, you look at veterans and military spouses, and a couple other populations, there's 130 million people right there. And the majority of those, the degree differentials of those 130 million versus other populations, 21% with degrees versus the national average of about 38%. So going back to that point, you just look at it. You are foregoing a large volume of people who can do the job once they're trained through different skills, but we're carving them out because of culture or policy or process or whatnot. And so I think I think that's going to be a huge win for this community in particular, because you can measure skills in this community much more so than you can the psychology degree or whatnot that might be in some of the other folks' lanes. And then permeability, and I'll talk this for just a second. This idea of permeability, the way some people say, well, it's how you help people go from the active component to the reserve component and back, or it's how you help people go from the transitioning service members to civilian workforce in the private sector or what. And it's all of that. But what it really is I would define it as how do we think of all the ways that we can fully aggregate the capacity of our country when and where we need it to meet national security objectives. That's what permeability should do for us. We have just started a pilot, and we came up with the relationship. So we're looking at 4 chief technology officers that we're going to pull into uniform in a reserve status. The CTO for Palantir, the CTO for Meta, the chief product officer for OpenAI, and the chief technology officer for OpenAI, former. And now the CTO for Microsoft and one other company I can't remember right now. And we're talking to them, and we worked through the policies with the Officer Enlisted Management at OSD. We looked at all of the statutes, and we can do this. And we're going to bring them into the Army in particular as the first mover. And General George, I sat in his office a couple weeks ago. He's taken this on as his personal objective. He and the new Secretary of the Army, met with them at the National Training Center a week ago. They're going to go to the Cyber Center down at Fort Eisenhower and go through the onboarding process for similar to a street-to-seat kind of approach. They're going to come in as majors in a gig-type way or a term reservist. And they're going to do their raising of their right hand in June timeframe. And this will be a way for us to have an Oppenheimer-like cadre. And they're not going to worry about pay. They're going to work in more of a gig approach. They're going to work on 0 to 1 problems rather than 1 through N problems. They're going to work on things like pace and scale and extensions of 3 and 4-star SIGs on how they solve problems. And I see it more as a tool it's not so much to get those 4 in that's important. It's a gateway drug to understanding that we can bring people in who didn't grow up in the same way we did in our jobs. And so these 4 or 5 people have about 500,000 followers that want to be them, who would be interested in serving if they see that those people are. So there's different kinds of benefits for that, and that's what I think gets at permeability. How do we fully aggregate the capacity of our country when and where we need it for national defense objectives? So those are the 10 problems that we identified about 2 years ago, and we briefed the Deputies Workforce Council, and Mark was one of the first. Mark and Patrick and Walt, we sat around, and I don't know if there was some gummies in your office because we just kind of hit it off, and it was good. And I saw the Alabama lanyard and thought gummies. So we hit it off and had some agreements on some things, and it was a really good use case to test this. And your community is so far along compared to the other functional communities. There's a couple close seconds. I think FM and acquisition have really good structures, but most of the department isn't as organized as you are, and they aren't as thoughtful as you are on what you've done with 8140 and the KSATs and the discipline with the work role development and coding and the cyber work role framework. And it really fit in with this thing we introduced called the labor market framework, which says there's a demand side of things and there's a supply side of things. And you can actually focus, if you use a production analogy, where everything starts as raw materials, then you extract those raw materials, you put those raw materials through a series of conversion processes before you bring them to market based off the market's requirements as articulated by the companies on the demand side. And that works for everything, the phone in your pocket, this podium, whatever it is. Well, it can also work for people, except people are fungible and they can decide where they want to go. So you got to add a little bit more nuance to it. And then if you take that analogy a little bit further, you could almost think of governments, the way the government hires people, especially on the civilian side, is more like a farmer's market in that analogy. You don't know if you're going to get soap or candles or some dusty harvest, at this farmer's market. Instead, we should be thinking about how do we create a super center? How do we think about you can walk in, everyone's walked into a grocery store, and you know that if you go, you're going to be able to get a ripe avocado, you're going to be able to get a can of soup, you're going to be able to get a packaged goods, all these different variety of things that you need based off of your requirements. We don't do that with talent. We hope we walk into a store and hope something shows up, and we don't do anything about it upstream. And the idea behind the labor market framework and this thing I call the people industrial base is how can we create a supply system and a distribution system that lets hiring managers and organizations in the department go and get what they want when they want it, because there's an incentivized supply system that matches the demand. And there's groups that we brought in initially to do this that were talked about as part of that Cyber Sentinel pilot. That was just a way to get at it with Pod that's in the room today, and Correlation One, and Coursera, and Strategic Ed, and a couple others. And they were first kind of to the market on this. And there's others in the room like Handshake that'll be able to do these types of things, or Noble Reach, which many of you may have heard of and are doing some things with. All of these groups, if we can incentivize them, they can be part of the supply side of the labor market. We can go further upstream. We can articulate what you need. 8140 lets you do that. And then we can create a distribution system that the suppliers can put people in based off of, I need a 2210 at this level. I need whatever. And over time, people will know and organizations will know if they put themselves into this funnel, they'll be able to have higher conversion rates, and hiring managers will get greater confidence if individuals are tagged that way, and the HR community will be able to convert people faster. Time to hire goes down, your conversion rates go up, and we'll see a much greater discipline through that process. Again, through this people industrial base that can be optimized for this. I'll say some of the early wins on that, we were able to go from an average of 3 weeks to get someone through the eligibility and qualification process to 3 days. There was an 87% conversion rate through that process from the people put in. So think back to the 350,000, 160,000, 20,000, and if you could make that conversion rate from top to bottom 87%, how much more confident would those million hiring managers have for this? And it works for the organic industrial base, it works for cyber, it works for HR, it works for FM, it works for any functional community. And we had 14 pilots going on as well. Another data point on that was the same intermediaries can be used to source or prospect uniformed and civilian talent. We did a pilot where we're pulling people into the Army for the uniformed accessions now across 10 MOSs. And 97% of the people that said, I want to pursue an opportunity with the Army, 97% said, if that doesn't work out, I'd like to pursue a job in the civilian workforce for DoD. So you can use the same supplier community for all your needs. You don't need to do a different set, which gives you an economy of scope and scale once you get it right. So as we look where we are, that's kind of what we've been working on, and it is a new mindset, and I just want to applaud the DoD and the service CIO teams for experimenting and taking a stand with us on this. When we get this right, it's going to show the department what right looks like, just as you've done with the 8140 series. Where we are now, and this is, Mark, get your blow dart gun ready. We are in a spot. Yesterday I was in a meeting with the OPM chief of staff and their DOJ counterpart, and we are in what I would call, I was telling Rob and Ramin on the break, we're in a severely unconventional set of times right now where everyone is coming at the table with different things of what they think are important. If you look at this very empowered group in the DOJ, they're focused on cuts and trauma right now. Make no mistake about it. For good intentions. You look at the personnelists, and they're focused on implementing those directed cuts and remaining compliant. with certain things. You look at operational leaders and the political leaders that are starting to come into positions, and they're looking around saying, I got to be ready. We got to have readiness. We got to be able to accomplish our missions. And that's what I'm accountable for. So you have these three different groups when it comes to people that have different incentive structures. And right now, the most empowered one is the first one until we get through this set of shockwaves that are going through the system. But as Mark often says, I think I've heard you say it numerous times, never let a crisis go to waste. And use this period to do the reforms that you want to get done. And that's what I think is the hope for the future, is we're going to go through what we're going through now, period, the end. And it's going to happen. But if you want to get to skills-based hiring, now's the time to do it. And you got to move fast to do that. OPM is going through the same things we are right now. And they are looking that January 20th, the merit-based hiring EO came out, and they are working on that strategy that's due in a couple weeks. And they are looking to DOD to help be the lead for that in terms of the example to get it done. Because as the one federal agency that's going to stick around as the largest federal agency with a set of important missions, when we have another Pearl Harbor event or 9/11 event and they do the forensics on it, we better be ready despite the incentivization that the DOJ had. No one's going to call the DOJ and say, why weren't you ready? They're going to call the department leaders. And we've got to figure that out. And the way to do that is through the creative things that you all are doing right now. And it's through things like being open-minded and changing some of the culture. Two quick stories, and I'd like to open it up for questions. When we did those hiring pilots, I'll just talk about hiring managers for a minute. And just to be honest about it, there was people that were queued up in that first set of cohorts as part of that people industrial base experiment, put through the HR process and put in front of hiring managers. Two instances, here's what happened. And these are people that work for us. One of them, a woman, went through all of the certification standards. She met all of the 8140 standards for a GS-12 role in the cyber community. She had worked at a bank for about 8 years doing protection of the networks for the bank. She wanted to move herself. She didn't need any relocation, and she was she wanted to serve her country in that role. The hiring manager said, you meet all the qualifications, but I don't feel like I can hire you because you haven't been a GS-12 for 52 weeks beforehand. And if that doesn't piss you off, then you don't need to be in here, you know? The second story was a hiring manager, same cyber community. We did the debrief from them and said, why didn't you look at these certain candidates? They said, because they weren't from my zip code and I don't have relocation to provide. We said, we already pre-cleared the people from relocation saying they would all relocate themselves to the job. So this talent was right there. So pay attention to what's going on, to the people that want to come work for you, that are qualified to work for you, that met your organization standards through 8140. That's the type of thing we've got to change on a cultural side. If skills-based hiring is ever going to work, it can't be, I'm looking for myself out there. It can't be someone who came in as a GS whatever and worked their way up, or retired as a colonel and put the civilian clothes on the next day. That's not going to be what gets us where we need to go in any community. I was a retired colonel. I did that. Went to the private sector, came back. But it's different. We can't do that anymore exclusively. You've got to be comfortable with someone that you don't know what they've done and where they've come from. And that's a big part of it. I would say the other piece is not just willingness to engage in those non-traditional pathways, but being brand ambassadors. Is someone's going to want to come work for this department after we get through this, despite the news they read, despite what they see about being somewhat disparaged by these cuts and whatnot. They're going to want to come work for it based off of how enthusiastic a hiring manager is at that interview. And when you're out and about and talking about what you do, and what you do is important and has purpose and has mission and is important. And so stay focused on that and stay focused on the mission when you're that brand ambassador. Before I close and just open it up for any questions or dialogue and being able to keep the event on time, I will say this is very personal for me. Having served, great. We've done our thing, but that's in the past. My son right now is in uniform in Syria, and he just 2 weeks ago, he had some partnered air assault mission with his Syrian, he's a fire support officer, and they had to go work on some high-value targets with some special mission units that were trying to prevent the resurgence of some Iranian-backed militias in the eastern Syrian desert. What he does relies on everything that goes on in this community and what you do and the intelligence that they act upon and the ability to protect their networks and their deployment processes and everything. So please, I'm really hopeful, and I'm begging you guys, get it right. Get it right in this community. It's too important, because if nothing else, not because of the chief talent management officer got up and said it, but because a parent of a service member, like probably many of you in this room, is out there doing their country's bidding as an instrument of national policy and needs you to get it right. So please keep doing that. So, Mark, I hope that wasn't too bad. And just, I guess, 5-10 minutes for questions or whatever is good. Yeah.
You have a question?
Good afternoon, sir. This is Cameron Mayette with the DoD CIO WID. Through development of the qualification matrices, two key success stories that I would like to point out is the Defense Acquisition University playlist and the military schoolhouse training provided by the Navy and Marine Corps, which has provided a significant boost for qualification options for foundational and residential. We hold bi-monthly readiness updates to majority of the DoD folks in the room here, and to implement the communications coming out from the summit here, my question is, and I'm sure we can take this back as a team, but the voice track, are we ready to start communicating out, focusing on DoD-sponsored skills-based training to inform the qualification requirements? Thank you.
I would say yes, but I will leave that to the people that actually are responsible for it. I would say just move out on things. I don't want to say there's no rules anymore. I'm not going to say that. Yeah. No, there are rules and they should be followed. But things are going to be, change will happen across the entire community when it's done there's sequential change and there's simultaneous change, and the interdependencies between the actors that are doing the sequential or simultaneous change, it has to be stirred up in a much more unconventional way right now, I would argue. And so the ability to get wins early is important. Just communicate those wins, communicate what you're doing, because that may help others flip as well over time.
Dr. Janicek.
Good morning. Diane Janicek, so nice to see you. Thank you for being here. Your comments are really, really refreshing. I think you've got a hard challenge ahead of you in terms of cutting the force as well as, embracing a greater, more robust cyber workforce. So thank you for all you're doing. My question was, and you hit it perfectly with the last response that you had in terms of, there are rules, but who knows what the rules are. In the old-fashioned way from the acquisition side, when you had a new capability on the industry and they wanted to bring it to the government, they would have like an industry day or try to get a capabilities briefing. And in the world that we're living in now with things moving so quickly, there's people in this room that are super passionate about what they do. They believe they've got the tools to bring to the department. Do you envision a way that we could accelerate some of those exchanges? I know FC is currently working on an onboarding, kind of like a tiger team for OPM, but there's got to be other ways where industry can say, hey, we've got this tool. I mean, we have CyberStar in the house. They have say, hey, how can we expose this to in a greater way with, following the rules, and that people are not afraid to take those briefings on?
Yeah. In the 2014-15 timeframe when they set up DIU, and DIU has become this like perpetual startup. They can't not be a startup. But they can't grow up either. The original premises there were what they learned was it wasn't about the ideas. There was plenty of ideas that were there. There's plenty of solutions that are out there. It was the department's ability to interact with those in a financially incentivized way. And the real breakthrough came when we learned how to turn DoD money to act like venture money. And instead of paying for work done, you can invest in work to be developed in an oversimplified way. The same in my opinion, can be done with this people industrial base, and the intermediaries that are focused on upskilling, the technology platforms, the partner networks that can be established like a manufacturing process. Everyone, Apple and Samsung don't make their phones. It's either Foxconn, Jabil, or Flextronics that make their phones, and it's the DuPonts that build the polymers, and it's all this. So you think of the same ecosystems that are focused on it. What we need to do is think of how do we create an incubator or an accelerator or a combinator kind of thing from a workforce point of view. I really think that the Cyber Academic Engagement Office and some of these other, if I got the acronym right, that those types of forums can be used for that. And again, showing how you can bring capabilities to the table, rapid funding to be able to do it in small amounts, and then turn it into a Hunger Games and see who wins.
I really appreciate you being so innovative, and I think that if you empower, these technical exchanges to happen even sooner than maybe a full incubator being set up, I think there'd be so much excitement. Like this community is ready, willing, and able to help you. So just thank you so much for what you're doing.
So one thing real quick, I was very fortunate on the early stages on the manufacturing side, I was a co-founder of a manufacturing innovation institute in San Jose, California, when Manufacturing Industrial Base Policy Office was investing in the reshoring back in 15-16 timeframe. And that consortium is interesting because it brought together about 120 companies, primes and suppliers and everything, as well as DoD agencies, and the sharing of intellectual property, that which was developed through funding proposals was shareable across all of the members to monetize. And that's an interesting approach if we want to do that in workforce as well. And that would be something potentially, how do you think about, again, as an incubation or a acceleration type model to pull, and that's what's going to be needed to incentivize it. OPM is interested in this. And the new OPM that's going to emerge from what we're seeing now is going to be more interested in incentivizing those types of creating tools than they are about worrying about classification and all these kinds of things.
So much. Count us in.
Awesome.
We've got time for one last question.
All right. Hi, Teresa Duvall, Brynt, Parmeter. It's so good to hear from you. I'm a step removed from this brain trust, primarily here in the D.C. area. I'm at Old Dominion University down in Hampton Roads in the Norfolk, Virginia area. And I'm also involved with the Coastal Commonwealth Cyber Initiative throughout the state of Virginia. So first of all, hearing this today, you really I appreciate how you have candor, and it's very difficult on a stage today to have that candor. So first of all, I tell you, I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot from you, and I took notes. I want to tell you that this collaborative environment that we have here with this honesty keeps this our FCA International, of which I'm a lifetime member, and I welcome you all to join. It's not a paid political I'm a volunteer, but it aligns, right, immediately with that ethical dialogue that we have between our government, our military, civilian, our industry, and our academia, of which I represent. And I do want you to know, down in the School of Cybersecurity, as the chair of the interns, 1,500, it's grown 200%. The trajectory is like this. So let me just share one thing that I hear from the students. USA jobs, I'm not going civil service. That's too hard. I don't know how. So when I hear some people say how cool that is and that everybody wants to do it, and having been both military, I was Navy for 23 years, and also a civil servant in the career field as a 2210 cyber accepted service, I want to have that as a very firm avenue for our our force. And so I'm very, very interested in being part of this today to look at how this affects our universities and how to get that streamline back. So to this entire group that's putting on this event, thank you for your service.
Yeah, I will say you hit the nail on the head. The requirement for this to be a multi-domain approach, it has to have not just a .mil internal bubble set of solutions to it. It's got to be .mil, .gov, .org, .com, and .edu partners at the table. Because at the end of the day, we have to hyper-personify the value propositions to the individuals that are in charge of and within these organizations. So it's not just your organization speaking for the sake of efficiency. It's how does your organization plug in to this, whether it's Old Dominion, whether it's the Air Force unit that's out there hiring people and doing their mission, whether it's a nonprofit or whatever it is. How do you personify it so that you can say, who is the person I'm sitting across from? What is the job they're trying to get done? What pains do they need alleviated in doing that job, and what gains do they need created? And if you can do that and create a personalized business model of value creation for that, it will permeate through the organization and then ultimately across the domain, across each other. And that's what we mean by this whole of nation approach and this broader people industrial base of things that are happening within it. So thank you for what you're doing, because you exactly described how it gets down to that hyper personification and localized personification of things. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parmeter. Thank you.